You've been talking to them for months, maybe years. You talk to them quietly at night before you fall asleep. You talk to them when you drive past their street. You talk to them in your head while you're washing the dishes or folding laundry, and they never answer. The silence that comes after someone you love dies has a weight that settles into your bones. But there was a woman who stood face to face with that same silence. She walked to a tomb before sunrise, alone, with no promise of an answer, and she refused to leave. Mary Magdalene. Her feast day falls on July 22nd, and Saint Teresa of Jesus understood something about her that speaks directly to the soul of your departed loved one. Magdalene didn't go to the tomb that morning because she believed in the resurrection. The Gospels make that perfectly clear. She went because grief pulled her out of bed before dawn and set her feet on the road. She went because staying home with the emptiness was worse than walking through the dark toward a sealed grave. You know that impulse. You felt it every time something pushes you to visit the cemetery, to talk to their photograph, to look for a sign that never comes. Right now in the comments, Mary Magdalene, intercede for the soul of, and add the name of your departed loved one. Put it in writing. Give your prayer a shape. And subscribe to this channel, because what Saint Teresa of Jesus discovered about Magdalene's authority over souls being purified was kept for those who are living what you are living right now. Every path holds up the next. It was still dark when she left. All of Jerusalem was asleep. The streets smelled of burnt oil and earth dampened by the morning dew. Mary Magdalene walked alone, bare feet on cold stone. Her hands pressed against her chest, holding a jar of perfume she had bought the day before with what little money she had left. She was heading to the tomb where they had laid the body of Jesus. They had taken him down from the cross on Friday. They had wrapped him in linen cloths. They had placed him in a borrowed tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, carved out of solid rock, and they had rolled a massive stone across the entrance to seal it shut. Magdalene knew all of this. She knew the stone was too heavy for her to move on her own. She knew there were guards posted by Pilate's order. She knew that going there before dawn, as a woman, alone, unprotected, was a reckless thing that any sensible person would have avoided. But she went. Because grief has a logic that common sense will never understand. Centuries later, in a small cell at the convent of St. Joseph in Avila, Saint Teresa of Jesus read this scene from the Gospel of John and stopped at a detail that most readers skip right over. Magdalene got to the tomb before anyone else, before Peter, before John, before any of the apostles. The first person to seek out the dead Christ was a woman driven by grief. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote in The Way of Perfection that the women who loved Christ during his passion showed a courage that the men closest to the Master did not have that night. And among all those women, Magdalene was the one who went the farthest, because she went alone. There is something in that aloneness that Saint Teresa of Jesus recognized as her own. She too walked alone many times, alone founding convents in hostile cities, alone defending her reform before prelates who wanted to silence her, alone praying in cells where the cold crept in through the cracks and the silence of God grew so thick it was hard to breathe. Saint Teresa of Avila knew what it meant to speak to someone who doesn't answer. She knew what it meant to search for a presence inside an absence. And that is why, when she read the passage about Magdalene at the tomb, she read it the way someone reads their own story told through the mouth of another woman. You know it too. That early morning when you woke up at 3 or 4 a.m. thinking about your departed loved one. That early morning when the house was silent and the silence crushed you because before, that silence used to be filled with their breathing, their cough, the sound of their footsteps going to the bathroom. You got up. You went to the kitchen. You sat in the chair where they used to sit. You looked at the clock on the wall, still ticking away the hours as if nothing had changed. as if the world had any right to keep running normally when yours had been shattered from the inside. And you talked to them. You said what you always say, that you miss them, that the house feels empty, that you don't know how much longer you can carry this. And the silence stayed silence, just like the sealed tomb of Magdalene. What Saint Teresa of Jesus saw in that scene goes far beyond a gospel story. She understood that Magdalene did something most of the disciples failed to do. She showed up before death expecting nothing in return. Peter was hiding. John was hiding. Thomas had vanished. The ones who had sworn to die with Christ were behind locked doors, trembling. Magdalene was on the road with a jar of perfume, on her way to anoint a corpse. She was going to care for a dead body. She was going to wash the wounds of someone who could no longer feel them. She was going to perfume the skin of someone who had already stopped breathing. That is what love does when it loses someone. It keeps caring. It keeps talking. It keeps going to the cemetery to clean the headstone, even though the person beneath the ground will never see it clean. It keeps bringing flowers, even though the flowers will wilt in 3 days. It keeps praying, even though the answer never comes in any way you can hear. It keeps their clothes hanging in the closet, because taking them out would feel like losing them all over again. It keeps cooking their favorite meal on Sunday, even though the plate goes cold on the table. Saint Teresa of Jesus called that attitude the determined determination. She used that phrase many times in her writings, especially when she spoke about prayer during seasons of spiritual dryness. But when she talked about Magdalene, that expression carried a different weight, a weight the Carmelite nuns recognized immediately. Because the determined determination of Magdalene wasn't fueled by faith in the resurrection. It was fueled by bare love, by the kind of love that stays standing after hope has already sat down. And here is where something begins that you need to understand before going any further. When Magdalene reached the tomb and found the stone rolled away, the Gospel says she ran to find Peter and John. She told them the Lord had been taken away. They came, they looked, and they left. The text says it plainly. They went back home. But Magdalene stayed, weeping, alone again, standing before an open, empty tomb that was worse than a sealed one, because at least the sealed tomb held the certainty that the body was still inside. Magdalene stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning the last place where her love still made sense. And that is something Saint Teresa of Jesus understood with a clarity she put into writing. A clarity that has direct consequences for what you can do for your departed loved one before July 22nd. Consequences that change the way we think about intercession for those who have already passed. But everything depends on something the Church took centuries to officially recognize about this woman. Why July 22? Why that date and not Easter Sunday, which is when Magdalene received the greatest mission Christ ever gave to a human being after returning from death? Why celebrate this woman in the middle of summer, on a weekday in many years, far from Easter, far from the liturgical calendar that marks the great events of salvation? The answer has a history worth telling slowly. For centuries, the liturgical remembrance of Mary Magdalene was a minor memorial. The Church commemorated her on July 26th because tradition linked that date to her arrival in Marseille, according to the Provençal legend that tells of her life after Pentecost. Other traditions placed her in Ephesus, alongside the Virgin Mary and the Apostle John. The date was fixed in the Roman calendar, but with the rank of memorial, which in Catholic liturgy means something important, but observed without the solemnity of the great feasts. That is how it stood for hundreds of years. Mary Magdalene shared the same liturgical rank as dozens of other saints. One more memorial among the memorials of the calendar. Until June 2016, when Pope Francis signed a decree that changed everything. He elevated the memorial of Mary Magdalene to the rank of feast, the same rank held by the apostles, the same liturgical dignity as Peter, as Andrew, as James, And he did it for a reason that Archbishop Arthur Roche explained publicly. Magdalene was the first witness of the resurrection, and the first to announce that news to the apostles. The Eastern tradition has called her the apostle to the apostles for centuries, and Rome decided the Latin calendar should reflect that truth. What does this mean for you, mourning someone who has died? It means the Church officially recognizes that Mary Magdalene holds a spiritual authority equal to that of the apostles. And that authority comes from a specific place. It comes from having stood beside the tomb when everyone else had left. It comes from having wept where others were afraid to weep. It comes from having searched for the dead Christ with the same tenacity you use when you search for signs of your departed loved one in dreams, in coincidences, in the creaking of the floor at midnight. Saint Teresa of Jesus lived 4 centuries before that decree of Pope Francis. She died in 1582. But even then, in her prayer and in her writings, she gave Magdalene a place that went far beyond the minor liturgical memorial assigned to her at that time. Saint Teresa of Avila mentioned her as a model of conversion, as an example of radical love, is living proof that God looks upon the repentant heart with more tenderness than he looks upon the heart that never stumbled. In the book of her life, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes her own conversion and compares it to that of Magdalene. She says that when she began to take prayer seriously, she felt ashamed of her wasted years, of a youth spent on worldly reading and empty conversation. And what sustained her through those first months of change was thinking of Magdalene, thinking that if Christ had looked with love upon a public woman, a woman pointed at, a woman the Pharisees despised, then he could also look upon her with that same love. Saint Teresa of Avila found a mirror in Magdalene, and that mirror gave back an image full of hope, an image that told her the past could be redeemed, that old wounds could become doorways if you laid them at the feet of Christ. Why does this matter for your departed loved one? Because the intercession of the saints works from experience. Catholic tradition teaches this clearly, and Saint Teresa of Jesus confirms it in the interior castle. Each saint intercedes with greater power in those areas of the human soul that he or she knew firsthand. Saint Joseph intercedes for fathers because he was a father and knew the burden of feeding a household with his own hands. Saint Monica intercedes for mothers who weep over children far from God because she wept for 17 years over Augustine until her eyes ran dry. Saint John of the Cross intercedes for souls in the dark night because he walked through that night to the very bottom and survived to tell about it. And Mary Magdalene intercedes for those who mourn a departed loved one because she was the woman who wept at the tomb after everyone else had walked away. She was the woman who stayed. She was the one who placed her entire grief in that spot and said with her presence what she could not say with words: I am not leaving here until I know what happened to the one I love. The specific grace of July 22nd has everything to do with this. When the Church celebrates the feast of a saint, the prayers offered under that saint's intercession carry an added weight. The Catholic liturgical tradition has taught this for centuries, and Saint Teresa of Jesus lived it every year in the Carmel, where the feasts of patron saints were entire days of intensified prayer. On July 22nd, the feast of Mary Magdalene, the prayers you offer for your departed loved one under her intercession carry with them the strength of the whole Church celebrating this woman. And that strength reaches purgatory with an effectiveness that an ordinary Tuesday in September simply does not have. But there is something deeper that Saint Teresa of Jesus understood about Magdalene. Something beyond the date and the liturgical rank. Something that has to do with the way Magdalene related to Christ during his public life, long before the tomb, long before the morning of the resurrection. From a very young age, Saint Teresa of Jesus had a special connection to Mary Magdalene. In Avila, in the middle of the 16th century, the lives of the saints circulated in handwritten books that devout families passed around. the young Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda y Ahumada, before she entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation, before the Reform, before the visions and the books that would make her a doctor of the Church, read those lives of the saints with the same hunger a teenager today burns through a streaming series. And among all the figures that captivated her, Magdalene held a place that only kept growing as Saint Teresa of Avila's own life grew more complicated. In the book of her life, chapter 9, Saint Teresa of Jesus speaks of her conversion. And what she says there is revealing for understanding why Magdalene matters so much when we talk about intercession for the departed. Saint Teresa of Avila admits that for years she lived a lukewarm religious life. She had entered the Carmel, yes, but her heart was divided. She enjoyed the visits to the parlor. She enjoyed conversations with people from outside the convent. She enjoyed being liked. And that inner division tormented her because she knew God was asking for more, but she couldn't bring herself to take the full step. What pulled her out of that stagnation was, among other things, the image of Magdalene at the feet of Christ. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote, in her own words, that she thought many times about the conversion of the Magdalene and that it helped her in the most difficult moments of her process of change. She thought about how a woman with a destroyed past had approached Christ without hiding a thing, weeping with her hair loose, with perfume pouring out, in front of the Pharisees who judged her, in front of the disciples who looked on uncomfortably. Magdalene did not wait to be worthy before approaching Jesus. She came broken, and Christ received her broken. That image stayed with Saint Teresa of Avila her entire life. When she was founding a convent and things went sideways, when theologians accused her of being a woman who wanted too much authority, when the nights in the cells of her new foundations were so cold, the water froze in the pitcher by morning, she went back to Magdalene, back to the woman who came weeping and was received with love. And here is something you need to hear carefully because it connects directly to what you can do for your departed loved one on July 22nd. Saint Teresa of Jesus understood that the relationship between Magdalene and Christ had two defining moments. The first was the scene in the house of Simon the Pharisee, told in chapter 7 of the Gospel of Luke. Magdalene walks into the house during a dinner no one had invited her to. The guests stare, some of them mutter. She looks at no one. She goes straight to Jesus, kneels at his feet, starts to weep, and the tears fall on the Master's feet. She dries them with her own hair. She kisses them. And then she opens the jar of nard perfume, a perfume worth nearly a full year of a laborer's wages, and pours it over those feet still wet with tears. Simon thinks to himself that if Jesus were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. And Jesus answers with the parable of the two debtors and says to Simon that sentence that echoes across the centuries, "Her many sins are forgiven because she loved much." The second defining moment is the tomb, the morning of the resurrection. Magdalene weeps again, but this time the weeping tastes completely different. This time she isn't crying at the feet of a living man who can comfort her. She is crying before the grave of a dead man who no longer has a voice, who can no longer turn his head and look at her with tenderness, who can no longer reach out his hand and say your sins are forgiven. The tomb is sealed. The body is inside. And the silence surrounding Magdalene that morning is the same silence that surrounds you when you talk to your departed loved one. Saint Teresa of Jesus meditated on the distance between those two scenes for decades. In the first, Magdalene weeps and receives an immediate answer. In the second, Magdalene weeps and receives silence. And what Saint Teresa of Avila understood, what she wrote in different ways throughout her works, is that the second weeping was more valuable than the first, because the first had its reward in plain sight. The second was pure. The second was stripped clean of every expectation. Magdalene was not waiting for Christ to rise. She was going to anoint a corpse. She was weeping out of love for someone she believed to be permanently dead. And that, according to Saint Teresa of Jesus, is exactly what you do when you pray for your departed loved one. You pray without seeing a response. You offer masses without receiving visible confirmation that they arrived. You light candles without knowing whether the flame means anything on the other side. You visit the grave and no one comes out to greet you. Your prayer for your departed loved one looks like Magdalene's weeping before the sealed tomb, an act of love that expects nothing in return. And what happened next, what Magdalene received when the risen Christ called her by name in that garden beside the open tomb, was the proof that her pure love received the greatest answer any human being has ever been given. But that answer came after. It came after Magdalene had already decided to stay without it. The main thread is still open. Because something Saint Teresa of Jesus discovered in her prayer about Magdalene is still missing. Something that has to do with the authority Christ gave her beside the tomb, and with the way that authority acts today on the souls being purified in purgatory. Mary Magdalene understood grief before any other disciple because she was the only one who dared to live it completely. The others ran. Peter denied him 3 times. Judas hanged himself. The rest locked themselves inside a room and barricaded the doors. Magdalene went to the tomb, and when she got there and saw the stone moved and the body gone, she did something that Saint Teresa of Jesus underscores with an insistence that only makes sense if you understand what she herself experienced in prayer. Magdalene stayed and wept. She stayed. Those 2 words change everything. In The Way of Perfection, Saint Teresa of Jesus writes about what it means to persevere in prayer when God is silent. She dedicates entire chapters to explaining to her nuns that the silence of God during prayer does not mean absence. That there are seasons where the soul kneels, speaks, begs, and receives in return, a void so dense it feels as though the words are dropping into a bottomless well. And Saint Teresa of Avila tells her daughters that it is precisely there, in that silence, where the soul does its deepest work. Because praying when God answers is easy. Praying when God is silent demands a kind of love that very few are willing to sustain. Magdalene sustained that love in front of the sealed tomb in the darkness of that early morning with no witnesses and no guarantees. And Christ rewarded her in a way that has direct implications for the souls in purgatory. He gave her a mission. He told her, "Go to my brothers and tell them I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Those words, recorded in chapter 20 of the Gospel of John, make Magdalene the first messenger of the resurrection. The first person in history given the charge of announcing that death had been defeated. Saint Teresa of Jesus saw in that mission something that goes beyond the Gospel account. She saw a spiritual pattern, and she expressed it in a way her nuns applied directly to their prayer for the souls of the departed. The pattern is this: the one who stays weeping before death receives the authority to announce life. The one who does not flee the tomb receives the privilege of knowing before anyone else that the tomb is empty. The one who accompanies the silence of death with her presence receives the voice to proclaim that death has been conquered. This applies directly to your life. You, who have spent months or years accompanying the absence of your departed loved one with your prayers, with your visits to the cemetery, with the masses you've offered, with that quiet pain you carry inside like a stone in your pocket, you are doing what Magdalene did. You are staying beside the tomb. And that perseverance in love holds a value before God that you cannot measure with earthly eyes. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote in the interior castle that souls who persevere in prayer without receiving consolation are doing a work that benefits the entire church, including the souls in purgatory. She said it with words born from personal experience. She herself spent 18 years praying and feeling almost nothing. 18 years kneeling in the choir of the Convent of the Incarnation, speaking to a God who seemed made of stone. And when the answer finally came, when the visions and the interior voices began to shake her spiritual life, Saint Teresa of Jesus understood that those 18 years of silence had been the most fruitful years of her spiritual life, because in them she had learned to love without reward. Magdalene learned the same thing in a single morning. She learned it all at once, concentrated in the hours between darkness and dawn. And what she received in return was the first appearance of the risen Lord. Christ did not appear first to Peter, who was the head of the apostles. Christ did not appear first to John, who was the beloved disciple. He appeared first to Magdalene, to the woman who wept alone, to the woman who stayed, to the woman who expected nothing, and for that very reason was ready to receive everything. Do you understand what this means for your departed loved one? It means that when you call on Mary Magdalene on July 22nd and ask her to intercede for the soul of your loved one, you are calling on someone who knows your grief from the inside, someone who knows what it is to speak to a dead person, someone who knows what it is to search for a body in a tomb and find the tomb empty, someone who knows what it is to weep without expecting an answer, and someone who received from the risen Christ the authority to be a bridge between death and life. Saint Teresa of Jesus understood this with a clarity that runs through all her writings. In the way of perfection, when she speaks about the prayer of recollection, she holds up Magdalene as the example of what happens when the soul comes before God with no pretense, no decoration, with an open heart and wet eyes. And she adds that this kind of prayer holds special power before God, because God cannot resist the soul that seeks Him with that nakedness. Your prayer for your departed loved one, when you pray it from that clean place in the heart, where you've stopped asking for signs and proofs, and the only thing left is bare love and blind trust, reaches purgatory with the force of Magdalene's prayer before the tomb. It arrives wrapped in that same quality Christ rewarded that morning, the perseverance of the one who stays when everyone else sleeps. And when that prayer rises on July 22nd, under the intercession of the woman Christ chose as the first witness of His victory over death, that force multiplies in a way that only the liturgy of the Church can explain. Picture for a moment what happens in purgatory when a soul hears that someone on earth has invoked Mary Magdalene on its behalf. Picture the warmth of that news reaching a place where waiting is the only thing that exists. Those souls have one certainty that sustains them. They know they will reach heaven. But they do not know when. And that uncertainty about time, according to what Saint Teresa of Jesus understood in her life of prayer, is one of the sharpest forms of purifying suffering. The souls in purgatory do not yet see God. They long for Him with an intensity that no earthly desire can match. Not the cruelest hunger, not the thirst of the desert. Nothing comes close to what a soul feels when it knows God is waiting, and it still has to wait. Saint Teresa of Avila compared that situation in the interior castle to the thirst of a person burning with fever who sees the water an inch from their hand and cannot reach it. The thirst is real, the water is real. The sick person stretches out a trembling hand and the fingers fall short, but the space between them burns. And what eases that thirst, what shortens that distance, is the prayer of the living. The suffrages, the masses offered, the communions dedicated, the personal sacrifices, the rosary prayed with the name of the departed held in the heart. Now think about what happens when that prayer reaches purgatory with Magdalene's intercession attached to it. Think about what it means for the woman who wept at Christ's tomb to place her hand over your prayer and present it before God, saying, "This person knows what it is to weep for someone who has died. I knew it too. And what they are asking from the same place in the heart where I knelt that morning." The communion of saints works this way. The saints in heaven see God face to face. They enjoy the beatific vision. But that does not disconnect them from the church militant or from the church being purified. The opposite. From the fullness of glory, their charity multiplies. And that charity is directed with special force toward those who call on them from earth, according to the spiritual kinship that exists between the saint and the one who prays. Magdalene has a spiritual kinship with the grieving person that no other saint can replicate in quite the same way. Other saints knew death up close. Saint Francis of Assisi called it sister, Saint Teresa of the Child. Jesus received it in peace at 24. But Magdalene lived something none of them lived. The complete experience of losing someone she loved, searching for him in the tomb, finding the tomb empty, and receiving the revelation that death does not have the last word. That entire sequence, from grief to hope, passing through emptiness and bewilderment, is the sequence you are living with your departed loved one. That is why Magdalene understands your pain in a way that other saints, with all their holiness, understand from a different angle. Saint Teresa of Jesus had a custom that her convents inherited. When a Carmelite nun died, the entire community began a day of intensified prayer for her soul. They prayed the office of the dead. They offered masses. They did penances. But there was something more that Saint Teresa of Avila instructed her prioresses to do. Invoke the saints who had a special connection to the kind of life the departed nun had lived. If the nun had been a silent contemplative, they invoked Saint Bruno. If she had been an active and founding nun, they invoked Saint Clare. If she had experienced a late and traumatic conversion, they invoked Magdalene. That practice reveals something Saint Teresa of Jesus understood about the spiritual mechanics of intercession. The saints intercede best when the territory of human suffering placed before them matches the territory they themselves walked. Magdalene walked the territory of grief. She crossed it from one end to the other, from desperate weeping to glorious revelation. And when you ask her to intercede for your departed loved one, you are asking her to act in a territory she knows inch by inch. Close your eyes for a moment and think about your departed loved one. Think of their name. Say it slowly inside your head, with the same syllables you used to call them when they were alive. Think of their face, the line of their jaw, the way their eyes changed when they laughed for real. The last time you saw them alive, the last thing they said to you or you said to them. Maybe it was something important. Maybe it was something as everyday as see you tomorrow. The smell of their clothes, the sound of their laugh, that habit of theirs that drove you crazy and that you would give anything to see one more time. Everything you feel when you remember them, that mixture of love and pain that tightens your throat, is exactly what Magdalene felt that morning walking toward the tomb. The difference between your situation and hers is that she received a visible answer. Christ called her by name, and she recognized him. You have not received that visible answer. But the Catholic faith assures you that the answer exists, that your departed loved one is alive in another form of existence, that purgatory, if that is where they are, is purification with an expiration date, and that every prayer of yours brings that date closer, and that Mary Magdalene from heaven looks upon every person who mourns a loved one with the same compassion she would have wanted someone to show her that morning when she walked alone toward the tomb of her master. That compassion is what you can activate on July 26th. But activating it requires something concrete from you, something beyond a prayer said in a hurry before you go to bed. Do this before July 22. Don't put it off. Don't write it on a to-do list that you'll get around to when you have time. The time is now. Your departed loved one is waiting. And what you can do for them in the days remaining before the feast of Mary Magdalene carries a spiritual weight you will not find at any other point on the liturgical calendar with this same configuration. The first thing you should do is request a Mass for your departed loved one. Go to your parish this week. Talk to the priest, or the person in charge of Mass intentions. Ask for a Mass to be celebrated for the soul of your loved one, and ask for it to be celebrated on July 22nd, or as close to that date as possible. Give their full name, not a generic name, their name, the name they were baptized with, the name God has known since before they were born. That Mass, offered on the feast of Mary Magdalene, carries with it the liturgical grace of that day. And the liturgical grace of Magdalene's feast is tied to everything she represents: the seeking of the one who loves, the weeping at the tomb, and the first news that death had been conquered. The second thing is to receive communion that day with the express intention of offering it for your departed loved one. Sacramental communion is the most powerful act a living Catholic can offer for a soul in purgatory. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this and practiced it. In her convents, communions offered for the departed were part of the daily routine of the Carmel. Each nun had a list of departed souls for whom she offered her communions on a rotating basis. And on important liturgical feasts, the prioress assigned special intentions so that the communion of the entire community would be concentrated on one particular soul. You can do the same thing on July 22nd. You don't need to be a Carmelite. You don't need to belong to any religious order. Any Catholic in a state of grace can offer their communion for a departed loved one. Go to Mass that day. If you can attend the Mass, you request it for your loved one, even better. If not, go to any Mass that day. And when you receive communion, before you return to your pew, before you kneel down, close your eyes for a moment and say inside your heart, "Lord, I offer this communion for the soul of my departed loved one, under the intercession of Mary Magdalene." May this communion ease their purification and draw them closer to you. The third thing is to pray the Rosary on the night of July 21st, the eve of the feast. 5 full mysteries. You can choose whichever mysteries you prefer. The glorious mysteries are the most fitting because of their connection to the resurrection Magdalene announced. But any mystery prayed with your heart fixed on your departed loved one has value. Each Hail Mary offered for them. Each mystery meditated upon while thinking of their life. During the first mystery, think of the day they were born. During the second, think of the day they received the sacrament. During the third, think of a moment in their life where you know God touched them. During the fourth, think of their illness or their death. During the fifth, think of the reunion you hope to have with them when God calls you as well. That Rosary prayed on the eve serves a precise spiritual purpose. It prepares the ground. It opens the channel of prayer before the liturgical feast formally begins. Saint Teresa of Avila taught her nuns that the vigils of great feasts were just as important as the feast itself, because the soul that arrives prepared to the liturgical day receives the grace more deeply than the soul that arrives distracted. The fourth thing is to make a concrete sacrifice that day, a fast, an act of charity, a small but real mortification, something that costs you, not something symbolic, something you feel. Because intercession for the departed rests on 3 solid pillars: prayer, sacrifice, and Eucharistic suffrage, all 3 together. Saint Teresa of Jesus insisted that prayer without sacrifice loses its force, that asking for a soul while you live comfortably without offering anything of yourself is like going to ask a favor with empty hands. Sacrifice tells God you mean it, that the love you feel for your departed loved one has stopped being just a nighttime emotion and has become something that moves your body and changes your day. And the fifth thing, which is the hardest of all, is to forgive someone that day. Forgive someone who has hurt you. It could be someone living. It could be the departed person themselves, if they left you with open wounds you still haven't closed. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote in The Way of Perfection that a prayer rising from a heart that holds a grudge loses half its strength before it reaches heaven. The nuns of the Carmel understood this clearly. Before praying for souls, clean your own heart, because God looks first at the state of the one asking and then attends to the request. These 5 acts form what the Carmelite tradition might call a complete day of intercession: Mass, communion, rosary, sacrifice, and forgiveness. 5 steps any Catholic can take. 5 concrete acts you place at the feet of Mary Magdalene on the day of her feast, and she, from heaven, presents them before Christ with the same urgency she had that morning when she ran to tell the apostles the Lord had risen. But there is something you need to understand about the relationship between Magdalene and the Carmelite tradition. Something that explains why Saint Teresa of Jesus gave this woman such a central place in the spirituality of her convents. Something that connects directly to your departed loved one and to what happens when Carmelite prayer and Magdalene's intercession act together on a soul being purified. In the Carmelite order, there have been convents dedicated to Mary Magdalene since the 13th century. One of the oldest was founded in Provence, in the southern region of France, where tradition places the final years of Magdalene's life after the ascension of Christ. The Carmelites who established themselves there did so with full awareness that they walked on ground associated with this woman. And the devotion they practiced had a feature that set it apart from popular devotion. The Carmelites venerated Magdalene as a model of the contemplative life, not merely as a repentant sinner. That distinction matters. For centuries, the dominant image of Magdalene in the Western Church was that of the converted sinner. Medieval sermons presented her as an example of penance. Artists painted her with eyes reddened from weeping, hair disheveled, clothing torn. She was the saint of repentance. But the Carmelites saw something more in her. They saw the woman who chose to sit at the feet of Jesus while Martha busied herself with the tasks of the house. They saw the contemplative, the one who chose the better part, in the words of Christ himself in the Gospel of Luke. Saint Teresa of Jesus inherited that Carmelite vision of Magdalene, and she wove it into her reform in a way that has direct consequences for prayer for the departed. When Saint Teresa of Avila founded the first convent of the Reform, St. Joseph's in Avila in 1562, she established a way of life that revolved around 2 axes: contemplative prayer and intercession for souls. The nuns of the Reformed Carmel spent hours in silence before the Blessed Sacrament. They prayed the full divine office, and they offered a substantial portion of their daily prayer for the souls in purgatory and for the needs of the Church. Magdalene appears in that structure as a constant spiritual point of reference. Saint Teresa of Jesus mentions her in The Way of Perfection when she speaks about the prayer of quiet, that form of prayer where the soul stops striving and simply rests in the presence of God like a child in its mother's arms. According to Saint Teresa of Avila, Magdalene reached that prayer of quiet in the scene at Bethany, when she sat at the feet of Christ and forgot everything else. The dishes unwashed, the table unset, the guests unattended. None of that existed for her. Only Christ speaking, and she listening. That ability of Magdalene's to be still before the divine presence is the same ability Saint Teresa of Jesus asked of her nuns when they prayed for the departed. She told them that the most effective prayer for the souls in purgatory was born from interior silence, from that quiet where the soul stops talking and begins to listen. Prayer loaded with many words and petitions piled on top of each other can be sincere, but prayer that places itself before God with the name of the departed in the heart and stays there, silent, trusting, has a penetrating power that words alone never reach. Because God knows what that soul needs better than you do, and better than any formula you could recite. In the history of the Carmelite order, there are records of nuns who took the name Magdalene when they professed their vows. The best-known case is that of Sister Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, a Florentine Carmelite of the 16th century, a contemporary of Saint Teresa of Avila, who experienced mystical states of such intensity that the Church acknowledged them by canonizing her. This other Magdalene of the Carmel devoted specific hours of prayer to the souls in purgatory and left written testimonies about what she perceived during those moments of intercession. She described purgatory as a place where the souls longed for the prayers of the living, with a desperation she felt in her own body during prayer. The connection between Magdalene the Evangelist and the Magdalenes of the Carmel reveals a spiritual thread running through the entire history of the order. The weeping of Magdalene at the tomb became the model for Carmelite prayer for the departed. A weeping that perseveres, that does not demand an immediate answer, that holds its ground in the place where it hurts without looking for an escape. Saint Teresa of Jesus built the entire spirituality of intercession in her convents on that model. And there is one more thing you need to know. In several Carmelite convents founded by Saint Teresa of Avila or by her immediate successors, July 22nd was celebrated with a devotional practice specifically for the departed. On that day, in addition to the solemn Mass and the proper office of the feast, the nuns added an extra hour of silent prayer dedicated exclusively to the souls in purgatory. A full hour in complete silence, with the name of each departed person written on a slip of paper that the prioress placed on the altar before beginning. That hour of silence was the practical application of everything Magdalene represented for the Carmel. The woman who stayed when everyone left. The woman who wept in silence before death. The woman who received the first word of the risen Lord. All of it condensed into 60 minutes of pure prayer, offered for the souls who wait. You don't live in a convent. You don't have a free hour in your day to sit in absolute silence, but you can do something similar. You can take 15 minutes on July 22nd, sit in a quiet place in your home, the living room, the bedroom, maybe the kitchen where you spoke with your departed loved one so many times. Turn off the phone, close your eyes, and say God, the name of your loved one. Nothing else. The name, and stay there, in silence, like Magdalene before the tomb, like the Carmelite nuns before the Blessed Sacrament, and let Magdalene's intercession do its work from heaven while you hold up your part from earth. Mary, he said, one single word, her name, and she recognized him. That is how the scene at the tomb ends in the Gospel of John. Magdalene was weeping, her back turned, unable to see who was speaking to her. She had mistaken the risen Christ for the gardener. She had asked him to tell her where they had put the body. And then Jesus said her name, Mary, and everything changed. She turned around and said Rabboni, which means teacher. And in that instant, in that exchange of two words, one spoken by God and the other spoken by a woman broken with grief, the mission that Magdalene would carry for the rest of her days was sealed, a mission she continues to carry from heaven. Saint Teresa of Jesus meditated on that moment with a depth few spiritual writers have ever reached. In The Way of Perfection, when she speaks about the prayer of union, she describes a state where the soul and God meet so intimately that words become unnecessary. And she holds up Magdalene in the garden as her example. She says that when Christ called her by name, Magdalene recognized him instantly, without prior explanations, without physical proof, without needing to see the nail wounds or touch the pierced side the way Thomas would ask to do days later. Hearing her name in the voice of Christ was enough for her to know it was him, because love recognizes the beloved before reason does. And Saint Teresa of Jesus adds something that connects directly to prayer for the departed. She says that in the highest moments of prayer, the soul recognizes the presence of God the same way Magdalene recognized Christ in the garden, without seeing, without touching, only hearing, only sensing. That is what your departed loved one is waiting to hear from you on July 22nd. Their name, spoken with love, spoken in prayer, spoken before God and under the intercession of Magdalene. Think about how you used to call them. If you called them Dad, say Dad. If you called them by their first name, use that name. If you had a nickname between the two of you that nobody else knew, use that nickname, because God knows it too. A name holds power in the Catholic tradition that goes beyond civil identification. The name is the whole person. When God calls someone by name, He calls them with their complete history, with their sins, with their virtues, with everything they were and everything they are becoming in the process of purification. When you speak the name of your departed loved one in prayer on July 22nd, you are doing what Christ did with Magdalene in the garden. You are calling someone by name. You are saying, I know you, I love you, I am here, and I am praying for you. And that prayer, wrapped in the intercession of Magdalene, reaches the soul of your departed loved one with the same force with which the name Mary reached Magdalene's ears that morning. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote in the book of her Foundations that when a Carmelite nun died, the sisters who had lived with her held a spiritual advantage when it came to praying for her soul. That advantage was simply that they knew her. They knew her name, yes, but they also knew her interior struggles, her weaknesses, her moments of greatest fervor, and her moments of greatest dryness. And that closeness made the prayer more precise, more personal, more effective. You know your departed loved one better than anyone on this earth. You know the corners of their soul that even the priest who heard their confessions didn't fully know. You know where they fell short. You know what made them suffer. You know which sins they carried and which ones they confessed and which ones they took with them unspoken. That intimate knowledge gives your prayer a specificity that generic prayer will never have. And when that specific prayer rises on July 22nd, under the intercession of Magdalene, it reaches purgatory with the precision of an arrow that knows where it needs to land. Magdalene listens to those who mourn a departed loved one because she knows that weeping from the depths of her own experience. She knows it with her body, with the hands that trembled as she carried the jar of perfume toward the tomb that morning that smelled of damp earth and silence, with the eyes that blurred from so much crying until the darkness outside and the darkness inside became one and the same, with the throat closed by the pain of having lost the one she loved most in the world. And now, from the glory of heaven, every time someone on earth weeps for a departed loved one and lifts their eyes toward her asking for help, Magdalene recognizes that grief as her own. She feels it as hers, and she presents it before Christ with the same urgency she had when she told the apostles, I have seen the Lord. That is the complete answer to the question in the title. Mary Magdalene listens to those who mourn a departed loved one because Christ established her as a witness that death can be defeated, because she herself wept before a tomb believing everything was over, because she stayed when everyone left, because she received the first word of the risen Lord. And that word was her own name, spoken with a love that made her an eternal bridge between those who grieve and those who already live in the presence of God. Your departed loved one has someone who advocates for them in heaven every time you ask Magdalene. And on July 22nd, the liturgical feast of this woman, that heavenly advocacy carries the strength of the whole church celebrating her memory. There are only a few days left. What you do with them will determine how powerfully your prayer reaches the soul of your loved one when the feast of Magdalene opens that door that only opens once a year with this particular grace. Now you know. You know why Mary Magdalene listens to those who mourn a departed loved one. You know that her authority as an intercessor is born from her own experience at the tomb of Christ, from that morning when grief pulled her out of bed and set her on a road no one else dared to walk. You know that Saint Teresa of Jesus understood this in her prayer and wove it into the spirituality of the Carmel as one of the pillars of intercession for the departed. You know that the liturgical feast of July 22 is a door that opens once a year with a particular grace tied to everything Magdalene represents. And you know what to do before that date. Request the Mass, prepare for communion, pray the Rosary on the eve, offer a concrete sacrifice, and clean your heart with an act of forgiveness. You received all of this today, and you received it because you stayed. Because you did what Magdalene did. You stood before something that hurt, and you decided not to leave until you knew what was on the other side. The other side was this. It was understanding that your departed loved one has someone in heaven who understands them, who understands your grief, and who is ready to present your prayer before Christ every time you ask. Especially on July 26th, not everyone makes it this far. There are people who listen to the first few minutes of a message like this and turn it off because it hurts too much. There are people who feel the weight of the absence and prefer not to think about it. Just push forward with the momentum of the days. Get up, work, eat, sleep, as if death were a closed chapter. But you stayed. You listened to every word. You felt that pull in your chest when we talked about Magdalene walking alone through the dark toward the tomb. And instead of looking away, you let that pull take you deeper. That says something about you. It says your love for your departed loved one is still alive. It says your faith is still strong enough to believe you can do something for them from this side of life. And it says Magdalene has already seen you. She already knows you are here. She already knows the name of your departed loved one because you wrote it in the comments or you spoke it inside your heart while you listened. There is something I want you to understand before we say goodbye. What you just heard goes beyond information or a theological explanation. It is a call to act. Hearing this and doing nothing with it would be like Magdalene arriving at the tomb, finding the stone rolled away and turning around to go back to bed. She made it to the door. She saw it was open, and instead of walking through it, she turned around and climbed back under the covers. That would have changed nothing. What changed history was that Magdalene went in. She leaned into the tomb. She wept inside it, and she stayed until Christ called her by name. You've made it this far. The door is open. What's left is for you to walk through it. Go to your parish this week and request that Mass. Mark July 22 on your calendar in red ink. That night on the 21st, kneel with the rosary in your hand and your loved one's name on your lips. On the day of the feast, receive communion with the express intention of offering it for their soul and make the sacrifice that costs you. Because if it doesn't cost you, God receives it, yes, but it arrives light. And the soul of your departed loved one needs it to arrive with the weight of your love turned into action. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote that love that doesn't turn into works is lukewarm love, and that the lukewarm soul causes God more grief than the cold soul, because the cold soul at least is consistent with its coldness, but the lukewarm soul says it loves and then stays on the couch watching time pass without lifting a finger. You have felt the pain of loss. You have felt the emptiness someone leaves behind when they go. You have felt that silence that moves into the house like a piece of furniture no one ordered and no one knows where to put. All of that is real. All of that hurts. But now you know that pain can be transformed into something that actually helps your departed loved one. And that Mary Magdalene is waiting to walk with you through that process on July 22nd. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to every word with an open heart and face burning, then I want you to know that what Saint Teresa of Jesus taught about Magdalene has only begun to unfold in what you just received. There is much more. There are teachings from Carmelite mysticism about the intercession of the saints that could fill entire years of study and prayer. There are passages from the book of her life, The Way of Perfection, and the Interior Castle that speak of how the souls in purgatory receive the help of the living and how the saints from heaven multiply that help with their intercession. And there is something Saint Teresa of Jesus discovered about the relationship between grief and the spiritual life that radically changes the way a Catholic walks through the loss of a loved one. Something that has to do with what happens inside your soul when the pain of absence, instead of pushing you away from God, drives you toward Him with a force you didn't have before the loss. Magdalene experienced that. Saint Teresa of Avila lived it in her own flesh when her father, Don Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, died. And that death catapulted her into a depth of prayer that until then had been unreachable. Pain as a doorway, loss as a launching point, absence as a path toward a greater presence. That is what the Carmelite tradition teaches about grief. And that is what you can keep discovering if you stay on this channel, if you keep listening to what Saint Teresa of Jesus left written for you in her works, if you allow her voice to keep walking beside you on this road you started today. A road that doesn't have to end when this audio stops playing. Think about what you were feeling before you clicked on this video. Think about the uncertainty you carried with you, that feeling of doing too little, of praying without knowing if it makes a difference, of talking to someone who no longer answers. And now, compare that to what you feel right now. Something has shifted. Something has moved inside you. That thing that moved is what moves every time you sit down to hear what the Catholic faith has in store for those who seek with an open heart. And there is more, much more. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote thousands of pages, and every one of them contains truths that can transform the way you pray, the way you grieve, the way you accompany your departed loved one. On the screen in front of you, there is another message waiting. Another moment of encounter with the teachings of Saint Teresa of Jesus. Another door opening toward a truth that can change the way you pray for your departed loved one, the way you live your grief, the way you understand what is happening with the soul of your loved one at this very moment while you listen to these words. Click on it. Go in. Stay. Do what Magdalene did. Don't leave when there is still something to discover, because the Catholic faith is inexhaustible. Every time you think you've reached the bottom of a teaching, you discover there is another layer beneath it, and beneath that layer, another. Saint Teresa of Jesus explained it this way. She said the soul is like a castle with many mansions, and that each mansion holds treasures that are only discovered when the soul dares to enter the next room. Your soul has entered a new mansion today. It has discovered something about Magdalene, about intercession, about the power of your prayer for your departed loved one that it did not know before hearing this message. Now the question is whether you will stay in this mansion or move forward to the next. The next one is there, on that screen, waiting for you, with the same voice, with the same faith, with the same certainty that what Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote more than 4 centuries ago remains the surest guide for anyone who wants to help their departed loved ones through the deepest and truest Catholic faith. And now, before you go to that next message, I want to say goodbye to you the way friends who care about each other do. With the truth on my lips and peace in my heart, you did something good today. You gave this time to learning how to help the soul of your loved one. That has a value you cannot measure, but God does. Every minute you spent listening was a minute offered out of love, and love offered is never lost. It never falls into the void. It always reaches where it needs to reach. May God bless you. May the Virgin Mary cover you with her mantle in the days remaining before July 22nd. May Mary Magdalene intercede for the soul of your departed loved one with the same force with which she ran to tell the apostles that Christ had risen. May Saint Teresa of Jesus accompany you in your prayer and teach you to remain in the silence when God seems not to answer. Because it is precisely there, in that silence, where the greatest things of the Spirit happen. Go in peace, pray with confidence, and remember that July 22 is close. Your departed loved one is counting on you, and Magdalene is waiting for your prayer to carry it where it needs to go.